Some songs don't just play on the radio, they start arguments. They get banned, protested, debated in parliament, and pulled from shelves.
That way. Hey, sing if you're glad to be gay.
Which almost always guarantees they sell more copies than they would have otherwise. The 1970s was a decade where rock music was pushing hard against every boundary it could find. And the establishment was pushing back just as hard. These 15 songs didn't just cause controversy, they changed what musicians were allowed to say, what radio stations were allowed to play, and what audiences were allowed to hear. Some of them were misunderstood. Some of them deserved every bit of the outrage they generated. And some of them were simply too far ahead of their time for the world they landed in. 15. God Save the Queen. Released in 1977 during the Queen's Silver Jubilee celebrations, God Save the Queen called the monarchy a fascist regime, and the British nation a collection of morons.
God save the Queen, a fascist regime.
Which was not the kind of Jubilee spirit the establishment had in mind. The BBC banned it immediately. The Independent Broadcasting Authority banned it. Record stores refused to stock it. And it still reached number 1, or almost certainly did, with many believing the charts were manipulated to keep it off the top spot during Jubilee week. The controversy wasn't just about the lyrics, it was about what the Sex Pistols represented, a generation that had genuinely run out of patience with the institutions that were supposed to represent them. The song didn't start with punk, but it announced to the mainstream that punk was real, angry, and not going away quietly. 14. My Generation. My Generation was released in 1965, but its controversy extended powerfully into the 1970s. As the generation it described came of age and inherited the cultural conversation. The stutter in Roger Daltrey's vocal, deliberately mimicking the speech patterns associated with amphetamine use, was banned by the BBC, who considered it offensive to people with speech impediments. Pete Townshend's lyric, with its central declaration that he hoped to die before he got old, became one of the most quoted and most debated lines in rock history as the band aged, and the sentiment became increasingly complicated to perform. What made it genuinely controversial wasn't the language, but the attitude of a wholesale rejection of adult authority delivered with such conviction that no amount of parental objection could diminish it. The song became an anthem for a generation and an embarrassment for every institution it dismissed. 13. Killing Me Softly. The controversy around Killing Me Softly is quieter than most on this list, but no less significant.
Killing me softly with his song, killing me softly.
Released in 1973, the song was based on a poem written by Lori Lieberman about watching Don McLean perform, which Lieberman claimed gave her the idea that became the lyric, when Flack's version became a massive hit.
With this song, killing me softly. With this song, telling my...
The question of authorship and credit became a genuine dispute. Lieberman felt her contribution had been erased from the story, while the credited songwriters Norman Gimbel and Charles Fox maintained they had transformed the original concept into something entirely new. The song raised uncomfortable questions about how creative credit gets assigned in the music industry, particularly when the person with the least institutional power is also the person with the most original idea. It remains a genuinely unresolved conversation about who owns a song's origin. 12. Je t'aime, moi non plus. Originally recorded with Brigitte Bardot in 1967, but released with Jane Birkin in 1969 and controversial well into the following decade.
Je t'aime, je t'aime, oui je t'aime.
Je t'aime was banned in Italy, Spain, Sweden, and the UK, where the BBC refused to play it, and it was condemned by the Vatican. The song's explicit sexual content, the breathing, the moaning, the lyric about going and coming between your kidneys was unlike anything that had ever reached mainstream radio, and the fact that it reached number 1 in the UK anyway demonstrated that the audience's appetite for transgression was considerably larger than the establishment was comfortable acknowledging. Gainsbourg understood exactly what he was doing, which is part of what makes it fascinating. This wasn't an accident or naivety. It was a calculated dismantling of the boundaries between private experience and public art, and it worked completely. 11. Brown Sugar. Mick Jagger has given so many contradictory explanations for what Brown Sugar is actually about that the ambiguity itself has become part of the song's identity. The lyric touches on slavery, interracial sex, and drug use in a way that was deliberately provocative, and the fact that it was delivered over one of Keith Richards' most joyful guitar riffs created a dissonance that critics have been debating for 50 years. Released in 1971, it reached #1 in the United States and the UK, which meant the controversy had almost no commercial impact whatsoever. The Rolling Stones themselves eventually pulled it from their set lists in 2021, with Jagger suggesting the band might not write the same song today, an admission that the cultural context around the lyric had shifted enough to make even its authors uncomfortable. Some songs outlived the era that made them possible.
10. Imagine. The controversy around Imagine has always been slightly ironic,
given that it's one of the most beloved songs ever recorded.
Imagine all the people.
But the lyric asking listeners to imagine no countries, no religion, no possessions was considered deeply subversive by conservative groups and governments who saw it as straightforward communist propaganda. Lennon himself acknowledged the contradiction of a millionaire recording a song about imagining no possessions from his enormous white mansion, which at least demonstrated self-awareness. The song was banned in several countries and kept off the airwaves in others, which did absolutely nothing to limit its reach. What makes the controversy interesting in retrospect is how threatening a song with no aggression and no explicit content managed to be. The ideas themselves were considered dangerous enough without any provocative packaging around them. 9. Walk on the Wild Side. Lou Reed wrote Walk on the Wild Side in 1972 as a series of character sketches drawn from the world of Andy Warhol's factory transgender women.
Waved his legs and honey, he was a sheep that said, babe, take a walk on the wild side.
Male hustlers, drug users, and somehow got it onto mainstream radio without anyone at the BBC apparently noticing what the lyric was actually describing. It referenced oral sex directly enough that when the BBC did eventually realize what they'd been playing, the embarrassment was considerable. The song reached the top 10 on both sides of the Atlantic, which meant Reed had smuggled a portrait of New York's underground queer community into living rooms across the world without anyone stopping him. It remains one of the most quietly radical mainstream hits ever recorded, a song that treated its subjects with dignity and specificity at a time when they were almost entirely invisible in popular culture.
8. Physical. Physical arrived in 1981, but its controversy belonged firmly to the decade's sensibility.
The song spent 10 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The longest run of any single in the chart's history at that point, despite being banned by radio stations in Utah, Arkansas, and several other states for sexual content. The music video, which ended with Newton-John surrounded by men who turned out to be interested in each other rather than her, added another layer of controversy that nobody had anticipated. What made Physical genuinely interesting beyond the outrage was the transformation it represented. Newton-John had built her career on wholesome, family-friendly material, and this was a deliberate step away from that image that her label had serious reservations about releasing. The audience's response made those reservations look completely misplaced.
7. The Jean Genie. Bowie spent most of the 1970s being controversial in one way or another.
But the Jean Genie touched nerves specifically because of its open celebration of androgyny and sexual ambiguity, at a time when those things were still considered deeply threatening by mainstream culture. Released in 1972 as part of the Ziggy Stardust era, it climbed to #2 in the UK and introduced a version of masculinity that had no interest in conforming to existing expectations. The controversy wasn't concentrated in a single incident, but diffused across hundreds of radio programmers, television bookers, and newspaper columnists who weren't sure what to do with a rock star who refused to fit any available category. Bowie's response was to keep going. keep changing and keep forcing the culture to catch up with him, which it eventually did on his terms rather than its own. 6. Anarchy in the UK. The Sex Pistols appear twice on this list because the 1970s essentially gave them two separate controversies to generate. Anarchy in the UK arrived first in 1976, and the band's subsequent appearance on Bill Grundy's television show, where they were goaded into swearing live on air and delivered comprehensively, turned a provocative debut single
Anarchy for the UK is coming sometime, maybe.
into a national incident. Grundy lost his job. The band was dropped from their label. Tour dates were canceled across the UK, and the record sold in numbers that would have been impossible without the outrage driving every purchase. What Anarchy in the UK actually was, underneath the controversy, was a genuinely well-constructed punk song with a lyric that diagnosed something real about British society in the mid-1970s: the stagnation, the class rigidity, the sense that the future had already been canceled for most people. The controversy obscured that for decades. 5. Living for the City. Stevie Wonder spent the early 1970s making some of the most ambitious and socially engaged music of his career, and Living for the City is the moment where that ambition produced something genuinely confrontational. Released on Intervisions. In 1973, the song traces the journey of a young black man from rural poverty to New York City, where he is almost immediately arrested and imprisoned on a drug charge in a scene that Wonder included as an audio drama within the song itself. The controversy came from its unflinching depiction of systemic racism and the criminal justice system at a time when mainstream pop radio was not remotely prepared for that conversation. Some stations refused to play it in full. Others edited out the drama sequence. Wonder refused to compromise the recording, which meant the song reached its audience intact, and on its own terms, a rare outcome in an era when labels frequently intervened to smooth over anything that might limit airplay. 4. Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll. Ian Dury released this in 1977, and the BBC banned it immediately, which was almost certainly the intended outcome. The song was less a celebration of its subject matter than a sardonic commentary on the music industry's relationship with excess. But the title alone,
Sex and drugs and rock and roll, is all my brain and body need,
was enough to guarantee that no radio programmer in Britain was going to take the risk of playing it during daylight hours. Dury had spent years on the fringes of the music industry, dealing with the physical consequences of childhood polio and the professional consequences of not fitting any available commercial category. And the song had the quality of someone who had nothing left to lose by being direct. The band gave it a notoriety that outlasted the song itself, turning a sharp piece of social observation into a shorthand for an entire era's attitude toward authority.
3. Give Ireland Back to the Irish. Paul McCartney wrote this in direct response to Bloody Sunday,
the January 1972 massacre in which British soldiers shot 26 unarmed civilians during a civil rights march in Derry. The BBC banned it immediately. The IBA banned it. It was banned in Ireland by RTA as well, which was the particularly striking part of a song calling for Irish independence, banned by Irish broadcasters who considered it too politically inflammatory. McCartney had never made a record this explicitly political before, and the backlash from the British establishment was immediate and total. Despite the bans, it reached #1 in Ireland and performed well in several other countries. The controversy revealed something important about the limits of what a former Beatle was permitted to say. The cultural goodwill that surrounded McCartney had a political ceiling, and this song found it immediately.
2. Glad to be Gay. Released in 1978, Glad to be Gay was an explicit,
unapologetic, and deliberately confrontational celebration of gay identity at a time when homosexuality had only been partially decriminalized in the UK.
If you're glad to be gay, sing if you're happy that way.
And was still criminalized entirely in many parts of the world. The BBC banned it, radio stations refused it, and Tom Robinson performed it anyway on every stage he could find, to audiences who responded with a fervor that suggested the song was reaching people who had never heard their own experience. Reflected in a piece of popular music before, the lyric didn't just celebrate, it documented, naming specific instances of police harassment and institutional discrimination with a specificity that made it impossible to dismiss as abstract. It was a political document dressed as a pop song, and the controversy it generated was exactly proportional to how urgently it needed to be heard. 1. Strange Fruit. Strange Fruit was written by Abel Meeropol and first recorded by Billie Holiday in 1939, but Nina Simone's live performances of it throughout the 1970s gave it a new and devastating context.
Bearing strange fruit.
The song describes the lynching of Black Americans with an unflinching directness that made it one of the most controversial pieces of music in American history, regardless of the decade in which it was performed. Simone's versions were slower, more deliberate, and more confrontational than Holiday's original, delivered to audiences who were still living through the civil rights movement's aftermath and the ongoing reality of racial violence. Several venues refused to host performances where Simone included it in the set list. Radio would not touch it, and Simone performed it anyway, understanding that the controversy was inseparable from the point that a song capable of making audiences this uncomfortable about something this real was doing exactly what music was supposed to do. 15 songs that didn't just cause controversy, they forced the world to have conversations it wasn't ready for. Some got banned, some protested, and all of them got remembered. Let us know which one surprised you most, and we'll see you in the next one.